One of my favorite quotes is from an author named Daniel Schwabauer, and he said that value is determined by the highest price someone is willing to pay for something. And that has always stuck with me, because what may be valuable to one person may not be valuable to another, but the overall value of something is placed on the highest price that somebody is willing to pay for it. And that particular quote brings me back to an experience that I've had in my life. So back when I worked here as an intern, I used to drive this little beat-up old minivan, 1999 Nissan Quest, okay? Which even then, that many years ago, it was an old van. The kids affectionately called it the Swagon. I drove it quite a few places because I was at the time not old enough to drive the church van. And so it became like a miniaturized version of the church van, and I brought kids everywhere. Well, I remember one time I had gone to pick up James Walter. I went to his house. He got in the car, and this was pretty typical. I drove him around quite a bit. So he gets in the car. We're on our way to church, and we must have been maybe half a mile from the church when we start seeing smoke. Just kind of, we're around a bunch of cars, so we didn't think much of it. I was like, wow, somebody's car is smoking. That's not good for them, is it? And then I noticed something. I was like, wait a minute. At each time we stop at a stoplight, there's still smoke, which means that it's probably either the car that it's smoking is right next to us, or it's my car. Sure enough, we pull into the church parking lot, and I notice smoke is now billowing out of my front driver's side tire, all right? And that's never good. To the point that the hubcap that was on the tire starts melting. And when I say it starts melting, it starts bending off of there. We had to peel it off to get everything off. And so that led to, we took it to a mechanic shop. They fixed the brakes. Apparently it was a brake issue. But fast forward, it was my very first day. I had taken this job. I drove in day one. We were getting moved in. When we were moving into the Talbot's house, and it's like my van remembered. We drove that van straight into town. I kid you not, the moment the tires hit 1488, the same tire starts smoking. Just perfect timing. And so, of course, I knew what the issue was, because it was the same exact issue, and apparently it was just, these are the kinds of things that happen when you have an old vehicle. So I went and got that fixed, and it was expensive, and of course, most fixes end up being way more than you expect them to be when it comes to vans. Well, I thought that was the end of it, but boy was I wrong, because a few weeks later, I'm driving this thing, and smoke does not start coming out of the tires. This time, smoke is coming out of the engine. And that's even worse, okay? That can never be good when smoke's coming out of the engine. And I'm over by Target, so I pull over into the Target parking lot, and I'm trying to figure out for the life of me, how on earth am I going to make this work? How am I going to, what am I going to do? Because I'm not a mechanic, right? I open up the engine, I'm taking a look, and it just so happens that this guy comes over here and he says, I hate to pry, but I'm a mechanic, and I kind of wanted to see what you're looking at to make sure, because you don't look like you know what you're talking about. And I'm like, yeah, I'll agree to that. So I was like, yeah, by all means, come and tell me what you think. So he's looking at it, and he says, why don't you go start the car? So I get back in the van, and I as soon as I start the car and it rolls over, he says, stop the car. And I was like, oh, this can't be good. So he comes out there, and basically he explains to me that the engine of the car is slowly imploding, and things are grinding on each other to create sparks that flew into belts that made lots of smoke and would potentially cause an engine fire. And so he said, so how far do you need to drive it? I just said, oh, I'm not too far, just to the other side of 1488 in Elk Trace. He said, to the other side of 1488? I wouldn't drive this to the other side of the parking lot. And he said, it is going to be, he said, how old is this van? I said, it's 20 years old. He said, man, you need to retire this thing, because there is absolutely no way that this is going to be worth fixing. He said, this is a huge fix. This isn't something that you're just going to be able to swap parts out. This is going to be really difficult. So I called my dad, who has always been very close to this van. And I tell him, Dad, this is what's going on. We're going to have to tow the van over to some place, have them look at it. Then, assuming that we want to get this fixed, we have to pay for parts and labor and all that stuff. Is it worth it? And my dad, with very little hesitation, said, yes, it's worth it. I'll call the tow company. We'll get it over there. And he said, well, at least take a look at it. So we tow it over to the mechanic shop, and even the mechanic said, this is not worth fixing. This van is old. This isn't worth it, okay? But he said, I'll fix it if you want me to fix it, but I'm just telling you it's not worth it. If a mechanic tells you that it's not worth fixing, that is a good sign that you need to give up, right? Because there's very little chance that they're going to say no to a potential job. That's potential money for them, right? So when they say it's not worth fixing, that you should probably listen to them. But my dad did not listen to them. Now, at that point, we decided we weren't going to be driving that as our vehicle around town. It was no longer reliable. But to my dad, it was worth the fix. They went ahead, they fixed it. My dad managed to get it all the way back across Houston without any incident. But then, ever since then, he's just been like, all right, we're done. He didn't sell it. He didn't want to get rid of it, but he wanted to make sure that he kept it. Why? Because that van wasn't just some old clunker van to my dad. When he sees that van, he doesn't see a 20-year-old minivan. What he sees is all the memories that we've had, the long road trips that we've had as a family. The fact that my sister both rode in a car seat in that van and took it to college is pretty impressive. The fact that we had spent so much time as a family on different outings, we had used that van to haul furniture that we had used that van to move us into college, move us into my apartment, all sorts of things, all the wonderful memories that came from that one vehicle. My dad said, maybe to nobody else will find this van worth it, but I think that it's worth it. It was the highest, the van's valuable not because it's of what it is, not because of it being a 1999 Nissan Quest, because everyone knows those things are worthless, but it has value because of the highest price that was placed on it. So tonight I want to talk a little bit about value and about forgiveness. If you're in Luke chapter 15, now the context here is pretty similar to something we see throughout the Gospels. Jesus is among both sinners and tax collectors and also the teachers of the law. And usually those two groups don't get along. The teachers of the law look down on people who are not teachers of the law. They look at them as sinners. And so they have this prideful attitude, and Jesus is constantly trying to address it. But there's some teachings that are not nearly as effective when they're only spoken. Sometimes the best way to effectively teach something is to tell a story, and that's why Jesus does this so often. We call them parables. Something that connects us on a heavenly scale by creating an earthly story that we can relate to. So in the context, to give it a little bit of context, chapter 15, starting in verse 1. Now all the tax collectors and sinners were coming near to him to listen to him, that is Jesus. Both the Pharisees and the scribes began to grumble, saying, this man receives sinners and eats with them. So that's just kind of to set the stage a little bit. This is nothing new in the Gospels. This is pretty much a regular occurrence. And at this point, I'm sure that Jesus is getting quite frustrated with having to explain to them why their attitude is wrong. But instead of just trying to explain it, he decides to put it to a story. Verse 3, he told them this parable, saying, what man among you, if he has 100 sheep and has lost one of them, does not leave the 99 in the open pasture and go after the one which is lost until he finds it? When he has found it, he lays it on his shoulders, rejoicing. And when he comes home, he calls together his friends and neighbors, saying, rejoice with me, for I have found my sheep which was lost. I tell you that in the same way there will be more joy in heaven over one sinner who repents than over 99 righteous persons who do not need to repent. So he tells this first story. And this first story is something that several people can relate to. There are several people who have, at least if they haven't been shepherds, they have seen shepherds. Anybody in here ever worked as a shepherd? No? I personally have not. I have never worked as a shepherd, but I do recall one particular instance, the only real context I have is I was in Dominica one time, and I met, it wasn't a shepherd, it was a goat herder, which is fairly similar from what I understand. I don't know, I don't have any frame of reference for that, but I learned a lot of things about herding animals while I was over there, following around this goat herder. And there was a couple of things that I picked up on that made this story make a lot more sense to me after watching all of that. So the first thing is that I think a lot of people get caught up on is the fact that the shepherd leaves 99 sheep in the open field and goes after the one. Now, a lot of people talk about, well, that's risky because what happens if all the other sheep just start going off in every direction? What's to keep them from doing that if the shepherd's not there? I'll tell you what's going to keep them from that. So you ever seen it, the stereotypical shepherd, they've got their long staff, right? If you ever see the little Bible school cartoons, they have their long shepherd staff. Now this goat herder also had one. And I always wondered why they had that. Maybe just to pull the sheep somewhere, if they get off track. But why has it got to be so long? I never really understood that. This guy didn't have a crook on he just had a really long stick. I thought, what is he going to do with a really long stick? How does that help? And I realized that this also kind of helped me identify another passage, which was Psalm 23. In Psalm 23, it's beautifully written, obviously. It's one of the most poetic and beautifully written pieces of Scripture. The Lord is my shepherd, I shall not be in want. And one of the passages in there is that your rod and your staff, they comfort me. And that just sounds so peaceful and so relaxing and so reassuring. But then I actually saw a herder use a staff on an animal, and I realized it's not comforting. You know what a shepherd uses that rod and staff for? I'll tell you this. Sheep, along with goats, from what I understand, are very stubborn animals. And so you can't just give them a gentle tap. That rod is not for just a gentle tap for them to understand where to go. They give them a good hard whack so they remember where they're going. The premise of a rod and a staff from a shepherd was a premise of correction, of criticism, of something that was putting them in the right direction, trying to guide them, but with force, with criticism. And so, because of that, when a couple of times, after a sheep tries to go the wrong way a couple of times and gets hit enough times, they realize, hey, I don't want to go that way. If a shepherd says, this is where I need to be, and this is where I'm going to be. Part of that comes from the fact that the sheep also trust the shepherd. They realize that if the shepherd wants them to be there, then that is where they need to be. That is the best place for them. They're going to stay out of danger. But it's oftentimes that we lose sight of that when we're talking about these 99 sheep in the open pasture. The point I'm just trying to make in all of this is to say that there was nothing wrong with the sheep being left there. They were in capable hands because they had found that correction and they had found that trust in their shepherd to know exactly where they needed to be. They were fine. Okay? Now leaving them, now he has to go find this lost sheep, and heavens knows where this lost sheep would be. To venture out and to find this lost sheep, there's all sorts of peril and danger that would come with that, obviously. But, for the most part, shepherds are not just going to let a lost sheep lie there. They're not going to just sit there as a sheep goes by and is lost. They're just going to be like counting them out and be like, oh, I must be missing one. Oh, well, it's just one sheep. From the outside looking in, we might do that, but for a shepherd isn't going to do that. A shepherd counts each and every single sheep as valuable. And so they're going to do what they have to do to make sure they keep that sheep. Every single one of them. They're going to keep every single one of those sheep. And so the sheep is valuable, which is why this shepherd goes out of his way. He goes and finds it. He comes back. His neighbors are happy about it. Why? Because they share in this joy that he has not lost something, that he has found something which was previously lost, that this valuable thing is now back within his fold. Moving on, there's also another parable that he tells in succession with this one. Or what woman, if she has 10 silver coins and loses one coin, does not light a lamp, sweep the house, and search carefully until she finds it? When she has found it, she calls together her friends and neighbors, saying, rejoice with me, for I have found the coin which I had lost. In the same way, I tell you, there is joy in the presence of the angels of God over one sinner who repents. So now he's shifted from comparing God's pursuit of us, or us as his sheep, and he is our shepherd, and now talking about the value that we have. I'm sure you've seen the demonstration, maybe you haven't, but if I were to take a $20 bill out of my pocket and I were to say, does anybody want this $20 bill? Who would not want the $20 bill? That's what I thought. Okay. $20 is worth a $20 bill is worth $20, right? What if I were to, crumple it up? It's still worth $20. You're still going to want that, right? Maybe there's a couple of dings and tears in that $20 bill, but so long as it's still a $20 bill, are you still going to want it? Yes, obviously, because it's still worth $20. Now, for this person, they lose this coin. Now, you could say, well, what's the point in turning the house upside down to go and find just this one coin? But that coin is still worth what it's worth. That coin is still valuable, and it retains its value no matter what. And so, yes, you're still going to go out, and you're going to go out of your way to make sure that you have that, and you're going to find it because it's still valuable to you. Just because it's lost doesn't mean it loses its value. And so, of course, this person's going to look up, turn their house upside down looking for this because this is something that's valuable to them. And they're going to be very happy when they find it. But, of course, those two things, those first two stories, make two points about how God sees his children. One of them is that there is nothing that God will not do to pursue his children, even if they are lost. The other thing is that God finds all of us valuable, whether we are lost or not. But those two analogies are based on possessions. Even a sheep is a possession, and this lost coin is a possession. But then Jesus makes it incredibly personal. Start reading in verse 11. He said, "A man had 2 sons. The younger of them said to his father, 'Father, give me the share of the estate that falls to me.' So he divided his wealth between them. And not many days later, the younger son gathered everything together and went on a journey into a distant country. And there he squandered his estate with loose living. Now when he had spent everything, a severe famine occurred in the country, and he began to be impoverished. So he went and hired himself out to one of the citizens of that country, and he sent him into his fields to feed his swine. And he would have gladly filled his stomach with the pods that the swine were eating, and no one would give him anything." So, we have this story of a young man, this son. All right? This is becoming a little bit more personal because we're not just talking about sheep and we're not talking about coins. We're talking about people here. And we're talking about people doing things that people usually do. This particular son is being arrogant and he's being selfish. He asks his father for his share of the estate. First of all, that's basically to say, you don't mean anything to me, Dad, except for a few dollar signs. It was incredibly disrespectful to ask. But his father obliges him, splits the wealth, and gives him his share of the estate. And so after giving him a share of the estate, the young man takes everything that he has, he loads up, and he heads out of town. He doesn't want to be a part of this anymore. He doesn't care about his family. He doesn't care about his father. He doesn't care about what's going on at the house. He doesn't care about any of that. All he cares about is living his life to the fullest, living his life in the moment. And he's going to take everything he can from his father and from his family in order to give him that advantage, in order to allow him to do that as effectively as he possibly can. So he is taking advantage of his father, taking advantage of his family, and now living as selfish a life as he possibly could, which is a huge way to fly in the face of his father. But it says in verse 17, backing up, it says in verse 14 that things don't go well for him, right? After all of this, after he'd spent all the money, because funny thing about money, it eventually does run out. He spent all of the money. Now he's got nobody. He's got no job. He's got nothing because there is now this famine in the land and nobody can spare anything for him. He's in a bad spot. He decided to live a selfish lifestyle, and he paid the price for it. And so now he's sitting here in the lowest of the low. He is literally feeding pigs, which is something that would be completely repulsive to anybody hearing this story. Anybody from a Jewish background would have been completely repulsed by that job. And the fact that he was longing to eat what the pigs were eating, which is just trash. Literally just trash that they're feeding these pigs. He was longing just to have that, but couldn't even find it. Finally, it says in verse 17, he comes to his senses. He came to his senses. He said, "How many of my father's hired men have more than enough bread? But I am dying here with hunger. I will get up and go to my father. I will say to him, 'Father, I have sinned against heaven and in your sight. I am no longer worthy to be called your son. Make me as one of your hired men.' So he got up and came to his father." And just stop right there. He finally realizes, you know what? As bad as things are for me right now, there are people in my father's house. The way things are at my father's house, I know that even if I was a servant, if I was just a hired hand, I would at least have enough to eat. He said, I don't know if I can ever be a son again, but I can at least go back there and have some amount of provision. I can have something. I can survive. He knows that his father can at least provide something for him. And so he finally puts all that together in his mind. He says, look, I'm going to come forward. He practices all this out loud. He says, I'm going to go to my father. I'm going to say, Father, I have sinned against heaven and against you. I am not worthy to be called your son. Just make me as one of your servants. He's rejecting his sonhood. He says, I'm not asking to be your son again. I'm not even asking for forgiveness. All I'm asking for is for you to hire me as a servant. That's all I want. That's all he's asking for. It's his only expectation. And so he goes back. It says, but while he was still a long way off, his father saw him and felt compassion for him and ran and embraced him and kissed him. And the son said to him, Father, I have sinned against heaven and in your sight. I am no longer worthy to be called your son. But the father said to his slaves, quickly, bring out the best robe and put it on him, and put a ring on his hand and sandals on his feet. If you remember what he had practiced, he said he was going through this whole routine, the same script that he had practiced before. He doesn't even finish saying what he's trying to say, and his father doesn't even hear him. His father doesn't even hear a word he says. He says, go and get the best of the best. Go and get him a robe. Let's get him fed. Let's get shoes on his feet. Let's make sure he feels welcome. Let's put together a party. He doesn't even hear what the son is saying, because he is so incredibly happy and elated that he has come back. It says, bring the fattened calf and kill it. Let us eat and celebrate. For this son of mine was dead and has come to life again. He was lost and has been found. And they began to celebrate. Now that's a beautiful story right there. That is an incredible story. Why? Because it's not just about the logistics of how God pursues us. It's not just the logistics of how God values us. It shows us that on a personal level, there is no distance that we can go from God. There is no act that we can commit. There is no force on earth that can keep God from loving us. And there is no sin that we can commit that He cannot forgive. With the Son that comes back, being willing to come back to the Father and say, I don't care what it takes. I just want to be in your presence. I know I've messed up. I know I've made a mistake, but I need to come to you because otherwise I won't survive. It is having that mentality and coming back to God where God is able to restore us, where God is able to make us sons again, where He is able to help us live out our purpose. And that is an incredibly beautiful thing, because we often get caught up in ourselves. And I know I have this struggle for myself, probably more than anybody else. I get so caught up in all the things that I have done wrong that I think there is no way God would want me. And even if not on that conscious level, sometimes I just feel so worthless because of the sin that is in my life or has been in my life. I think about the mistakes that I've made in the past and I think, wow, I have really messed this up. I'm not valuable. I'm not useful. I'm not worthwhile. And those are the lies that Satan tells us. Satan tells us on a regular basis that we're not good enough, that we won't amount to enough, all based on the things that have happened in our past. But what Jesus is making clear through this teaching is that he is saying it doesn't matter what you've done in the past because you are still a son. Just like a coin is worth just as much as another coin, and a sheep is worth just the same as another sheep. That sheep that was lost was just as much a sheep in need of a shepherd as the other 99. And that coin still had value. This son still has value. Just because he was lost doesn't mean he wasn't a son in need of a father. Speaking of which, continuing on in verse 25, this older son was in the field, and when he came and approached the house, he heard music and dancing. He summoned one of the servants and began inquiring what these things could be. And he said to him, your brother has come, and your father has killed the fattened calf because he has received him back safe and sound. That should be good news, right? His brother has come back. And just like the father was elated because he valued his son, you would think that his brother would be ecstatic, would be excited. It says in verse 28, but he became angry and was not willing to go in. And his father came out and began pleading with him. But he answered and said to his father, look, for so many years I have been serving you, and I have never neglected a command of yours, and yet you have never given me a young goat, so that I might celebrate with my friends. But when this son of yours came, who has devoured your wealth with prostitutes, you killed the fattened calf for him. This son is holding a bit of animosity. Because to him, he sees what this other son has done, and he is incredibly angry. One, because it disrespected his father. It disrespected them as a family. Clearly, he didn't make the right decisions. Clearly, he can't be trusted. Why on earth, after all this time, after everything that he's done, would the father bring him back in? Why on earth would the father value him enough to throw this celebration for him? What's the purpose of that? Why would he do something like that when, as this son points out, the older son points out, you've never even given me a fattened goat. You've never given me anything to celebrate with my friends. So what's the answer? It says in verse 31, he said to him, son, you have always been with me, and all that is mine is yours. But we had to celebrate and rejoice, for this brother of yours was dead and has begun to live, and was lost and has been found. You notice the change in language here that he uses? The brother says, this son of yours did all these things wrong. This son of yours squandered your wealth. He turned away from you. He disrespected you. He left us. He neglected us. He disowned us. He doesn't deserve a thing. And he says, the father says to the son, we had to celebrate not because of this son of mine, but because this brother of yours was lost and is found. Still a son in need of a father. That son, the older son, was just as much son of that father as the younger son was. And that father valued his son as any parent would. And so it becomes incredibly more personal because it's not just about coins, sheep. What were to happen if you thought your son, your child, was gone, never to return, had completely turned their back on you, and didn't want anything to do with you, and then suddenly they came back when you thought there was no hope? Can you imagine the image that puts in people's heads when they're listening to Jesus tell this story to the teachers of the law who were sitting there listening to this and their arrogance? Now, there's several different ways you can break down this story, and there's several different things you can take from this story, but the most valuable thing I think to take from this, given especially the context, is the value that we place on ourselves and on others. Do we base the value of others on our own standards? Or do we base the value of others on the highest price someone is willing to pay for them? There is nothing that this father would not do to have back his son. There is nothing that that shepherd wouldn't do to get back his sheep. There is no price God won't pay to redeem us. The evidence of that is seen at the cross. And yet, what Jesus points out here in this story is that there are so many who are still focusing on the things that happen in this world, on people's past, on where they come from, the mistakes that they make. And Jesus is saying, their value is not based on that to me. Their value is based on the price that I'm willing to pay for them. And that is the blood of Christ, the sacrifice of God's only Son. And there is not a price that we can pay that is higher than that. There is not a value that we're capable of placing on anything higher than that, and yet Christ died for each and every one of us. But sometimes when we look around and we see each other, and maybe even sometimes ourselves, our unit of value is diminished greatly because we base it on things in this world. The teachers of the law based their value on how well somebody followed out the law. But there's plenty of metrics for how people determine value, whether it be financial success, popularity, power. There are plenty of metrics that people use to figure out value. But the ways of this world and the value that the value system that the world uses is completely corrupted. Intentionally so, because it doesn't matter how you seek that value in this life. If you seek to be valuable in the world's eyes, you will never be satisfied. You will never find fulfillment so long as you try to seek that value from this world. You'll never have enough money, you'll never have enough success, you'll never have enough power. There just simply isn't enough to fulfill us in this life. But Satan has us convinced that if we don't do things a certain way, if we don't have value according to the rest of the world, then we don't have value. But there's nothing that can happen in this world that changes our value. There is nothing in this life that changes the price that was paid for us. We often get caught up in judging ourselves, judging others. And the teachers of the law certainly were judging these individuals based on what they had done, based on the way that they lived out the law or the lack thereof. But I think this comes from a skewed view of righteousness, a skewed view of how we are to live out our lives. In Ephesians chapter 2, if you want to turn with me real quick, there. Paul has to make this correction to the Ephesians because there's this sense that value and purpose is based on how well you live out the law. But he says in chapter 2, starting in verse 8, "For by grace you have been saved through faith, and not of yourselves, it is the gift of God, not as a result of works, so that no one may boast. For we are his workmanship, created in Christ Jesus for good works, which God prepared beforehand so that we would walk in them. We get this whole thing twisted up. It's not that we are doing good things to be a Christian. It's that we are Christians, and therefore we were created for the purpose of doing good. But because of that skewed view of righteousness, we often rely on our value system accounting for how righteous are we, and that determines how good or how valuable we are. When we stop and take a look at it, though, what Paul makes clear and what Christ makes clear is that our value doesn't come from our abilities, because if it did, there is no way we'd be able to earn that. There is no way we'd be able to earn enough value to make it into heaven or to be really righteous. But our value comes from the grace of God. So how often then do we use that as our metric of value? How often do we use God's grace and the price that God was willing to pay as the metric for what people are worth? Maybe it's the metric that we use to determine our own worth. I mean, think about the prodigal son. He thought that he was worthless to his father based on all the things that he had done. Based on all the mistakes that he made, he thought there's no way I can go back there and be a son again. But that is not how the father saw it. Or maybe, on the flip side of that, the older son, who valued his brother based on his brother's actions, his brother's own righteousness. But none of those things changed the fact that he was still a brother and he was still a son. When we look at each other, do we look at each other the way that God looks at us? Or do we look at each other the way the world looks at us? We've been very conditioned to judge people based on certain criteria, especially in our society. But I would challenge you to really introspectively look at yourself and determine, how do you value yourself? How do you value others? Because if you value others based on criteria in the world, then there's a good chance that you're going to end up very unhappy. There is a reason that we are given the gospel. There's a reason that we are told what to do. The reason being, the reason that we're given this righteousness and the reason we adhere to this righteousness is not because it's what makes us valuable, but because, as Ken pointed out this morning, it is the practical, abundant life. God's word was given to us to be practical, to show us the way, to give us what was truly meaningful in this life, to live out our purpose. And what the father has to explain to the older son is that you think that you're missing out because you didn't have all these things, but the value you had and the gift that you had was being in my presence all along. Being stable, not having to hit rock bottom, not having to worry about where your next meal was going to come from. The fact that you stayed righteous to me only means that you stayed in my presence, that you stayed where you needed to be, and that you didn't go through the hardships that your brother went through. Sometimes we do look out at other people and we think, why is it even fair that they can go through this? Why is it fair that I have to do the right thing? Because sometimes doing the right thing is hard and it gets tiring. And we get tired of doing the right thing, but the truth of the matter is, by doing the right thing, we hold on to the promises of God. And so it's not righteousness that gives us our value, but we cling to that righteousness because we know that we have a father and we have a good shepherd who wants to keep us in his fold, to keep us where we are supposed to be. And so long as we recognize that our value doesn't come from our own actions, that it comes from God, then we're not going to go off seeking something else. We're not going to take our share of things and go off to another country. We're not going to go looking for greener grass in another pasture. The only thing that we're going to be looking for is guidance from the Lord God. And so as we go from here this week, I want to challenge each and every one of us, myself included, to ask ourselves, how do you value the people around you? How do you value yourself? What is your metric of value? Because if it is based in this world, you're going to be very unhappy. And maybe based on the metric you have in value right now, you look at yourself and think, I'm not worth it. I'm not worthy of anything. I can't be enough. There is no way that God would ever want me, and we feel so lowly about ourselves because of how we value ourselves. Maybe that's what's going on in your life right now. Let me tell you something. You are not worthless. You are as valuable as the highest price that someone is willing to pay for you, and God gave up His Son for you. And there is nothing that you can do, no sin that you can commit, no darkness that you have passed through, no depth that you have reached, that God will not reach for you, that God will not redeem you. And so tonight, if that is where you're feeling, if you're feeling lost, if you're feeling worthless, there is a wonderful option here. To be immersed in the waters of baptism, in the death, burial, and resurrection of Christ, to feel that new life, not because of anything that you've done, but because of what God has done. People get in this habit of thinking that they have to get their life right to come to Jesus. You don't get your life right to come to Jesus. You come to Jesus to get your life right. Don't let anything hold you back tonight. If there is anything in your heart that is telling you that you need to be washed in the waters of baptism, that you need to respond to the gospel, that you need to be made new, that you need to be a child of God again, you have that opportunity tonight. Maybe that's not the case tonight. Maybe there are just things going on in your life and you are in need of prayer. Things feel dark, things feel difficult, and you think, well, nobody wants to hear about my problems. Each and every person in this room is valuable. Just as valuable as the person sitting next to you. The same price was paid for us all, and so your troubles are not meaningless. Your troubles are not a burden here. If you have something that is burdening you right now, if you need prayers, I encourage you to come forward. Whatever your need is, all together we stand and sing.